7, 6?
I don't know.
Like,
I don't know. I'll say something.
The Voice 17104.com.
I gave you my phone, didn't I?
This is Zanetta Wingfield, and you're listening to The Voice 17104.com. The Voice 17104.com. Welcome to Did You Know? Podcast, your host, Richard Utley, dedicated to the African American viewers. The program is aimed to celebrate African American culture and deal with the real and relevant topics that impact the everyday lives of the African American community through frank and insightful dialogue with local and national influencers. Every day, there is another horrible, discouraging news story, directly or indirectly, impacting African Americans. But we need to look at the shining stars in the galaxy of Black America. It is time to tell our story.
Good evening, and welcome to another Did You Know? Well, I got some good news tonight. I'm moving on up now. I now have a channel on a TV station called voicetv.org. And then you type in Did You Know? And you can watch me and see me anytime you want, 24/7. So I'm moving on up. And the reason I'm having these programs, as I've shared with you before, because I think we have to be the ones who tell our own stories and to define who we are. That's the reason why I have this program. That's the reason why I have, this whole program, Did You Know? And the reason why I do this is because there's a lot of things we don't know. Just like tonight, I got somebody on, because this is February, and this is Black History Month. So I have somebody coming on shortly. But I want to bring up some other things because I think that we need to think about them, because we don't. I read a lot, and I read things, and just to make you think. I was reading somewhere in Massachusetts, they're considering organs for freedom, meaning that somebody's incarcerated, and if they give an organ or sell an organ, basically what it comes down to, they may get 60 days off, or they may get a year off. But the fact is somebody's thinking about that. And what that tells me is that's people that got money. But think about it. Somebody's been thinking about that. So it's just a did you know thing. I was reading something also today. It's just amazing to me. Even though it's in Baltimore, but I wanted you to think about it. It could be in Pennsylvania. It could be all over. I was reading where 23 Baltimore schools have 0 students proficient in math on a state test. There was a project analyzed it and found out that, you heard me, 23 Baltimore schools, some of the kids could not do math proficiently at the grade level that they're at. See, we got to keep up with stuff like that. Because, I was watching something the other day when Ben Crump was on, and he talked about education. So if we don't get education, where does that put us at? That puts us in the hole. That's almost like a prison sentence. That's what he said. So, I think it's very important that we're going to have to do a better job in educating our children. We're going to have to educate them on math. We're going to have to educate them on spelling, reading, and writing, and history, because those things are very important. And if we don't do that, then shame on us. Think about that. All of us know that half these school districts, and some of us not the fault of their own, but we need to pick up the mantle and make sure that our kids get a good quality education. Because if we don't do that, then shame on us. We keep waiting on everybody else to ride that horse. My favorite statement, waiting on them to ride into our neighborhood and save us. And that's not going to happen. So I think it's very important that all of you start to pay much more attention to the schools that you send your children to and to see what kind of education they get. And just like you rally around all the sports, football, basketball, you can tell me who scored this touchdown and who made this basket. Maybe we need to talk about what are the grade levels and what are our children learning in the schools, because it's important, because they are our future leaders. Two other things I'm going to bring up, and then I think today is so important about history, I'm going to talk about it, is that things that I say, did you know? Are you aware that under Pennsylvania law, that you know that all these people want to know what, especially about police departments, has there been discipline? Is there complaints about a particular officer? They don't have to tell you. That's right. They don't have to tell you, the public. They can keep that close-lipped. Some police departments, they will work with you if you want to know certain things, but you need to understand that. So we want to make sure that we have good police officers, men and women. And I will bring up again that we need more police officers that look like you and I. So stop playing lip service saying, well this, well that. We need to step up to the plate. The other thing is that I don't know if you're aware of, but in a couple of school districts around here, they have now decided that they were going to let their police officers carry semi-rifles. Yes, there's a couple already that made that decision because of things that's going along in our communities. So I'm going to leave you with this. I say it all the time. Gun violence is killing our community. Gun violence is killing our young people. Gun violence is making me, you, your grandfathers, your grandmothers, your cousins, your sisters scared to go out sometime, which is a tragedy. We live better than that, and we know better than that. You know, you all saw where somebody in kindergarten shot the teacher. That could have been you, that could have been me, that could have been anybody. So we're going to have to really, really, really continue to start to be more accountable of our neighborhoods. We have to. And I will continue to preach that as long as I have a platform to talk about. The other thing is, it's time for you guys to step up to the plate to run for public office. So stop complaining. You don't like the judge, you don't like the district justice, you don't like the city council person, you don't like the mayor, you don't like the county commissioner, you don't like nobody. Well, then if you don't like nobody, then maybe you need to run for office. So think about it, because it's coming up soon. So if you've been sitting on the fence, it's time for you to make that decision to run for public office. Tonight, I'm going to change up. I'm going to bring Lenwood Sloan on. And some of you know Lenwood, some of you don't know Lenwood. Lenwood is a person that believes in writing all kinds of articles, and he's a person that I call loves history. I've had the fortunate that many of you know in the Central Pennsylvania Black Directory, which all of you know that I'm the publisher and owner of, is that even though Pittsburgh and a number of places had their own directory, I chose to put history in mine because I thought that we need to know our history. So for the 6 and the 7 years that I've had this magazine in terms of history, I've had Lenwood write stories about people that we need to know about. Now, like as I said before, who's going to tell our stories if we don't tell them ourselves? And we see what's happening in America now. You see what's happening in Florida. You see they're ripping out our history out of books. You see that the testing about testing, they want to drop so things about Black history. The problem is America, we've never dealt with race and history, and we need to deal with it and then move on. The issue has been why we need to know this and why we need to know that. Well, folks, my point tonight is we need to know it ourselves. And if we need to teach ourselves it, then that's what we should do. So I have Brother Lenwood Sloan on here. We're going to talk about history tonight. I've known Lenwood a very long time. Fortunately for both of us, we both grew up in the inner city. We both grew up in Pittsburgh. We both went to the same high school, Westinghouse High School. But I would admit we did have teachers in our school that did talk about Black history. And many of you know, most of us, especially older people like us that grew up, the church talked about history because church was a very important part of our community and history was a very interesting part. So I'm telling you all now that we're going to have to start teaching our own history. We're going to have to start telling people about our history. You have to tell your children about our history. Because if you tell our children about history, then they will have a different outlook of themselves. Because a lot of pictures that have been painted of have not been pretty. It hasn't been truthful, but it hasn't been pretty. So Lenwood, welcome.
Thank you very much.
So I have you on here tonight because this is Black history. And I felt tonight I wanted you to tell us why you think Black history is important, or African American history. Why do you think it's important? And after you tell us why it's important, tell us some stories that you think that we should know about.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. Richard and I do go back to Westinghouse High School. And you know, all you really need is a few teachers whose spirit is like yeast or like turnkeys. And we had one, Mr. Herman J. McLean at Westinghouse High School. I really never knew, Richard, that I lived in a de facto segregated neighborhood until my second year at Temple University in a sociology class. And they were explaining all of the variables, all the data, all the statistics, which made a de facto segregated neighborhood. And I started saying, wait a minute, they're describing homework. They're describing, I never knew I was poor because we grew up rich in spirit. We grew up under the philosophy that poverty was a stop on the journey, not the destination. And that if you had an impoverished spirit, no matter how much money you made in your pocket, you were never poor, because with that spirit, you had the power to engage and convene in life. And with that engagement, you had the power to educate yourself. And with that education, you had the power to elevate yourself. So engage in home, church, and community, educate yourself, both in the formal way and in the lifelong learning way. As our grandparents and our great grandparents used to say, live and learn, and also elevate yourself from a vision and of a possibility. I think we are just spirited community because we're seeing the struggle come again. The Hindus have a term, Richard, called the Kali Yuga. It means falling backwards into darkness. If you don't know your history, then when the change goes down on you, you are falling backwards into darkness. You don't even see the pathway or the out. So I'm gonna start with the fact that Black History Month really began with African American History Week by Carter G. Woodson in the 1920s. He had a date in February, which he organized a national conversation on African Americans. That conversation was at least 100 years old by the time he re-invoked the color convention models of the early 1820s. And he started uh, uh, promoting the notion from a day to a week and a week to a month. No, we didn't grab Black History Month in February because it was the shortest month of the year. So let's wipe that myth off the table right now. It was because of the three occurrences of Abraham Lincoln's birthday on February 12th, and some of you don't even know that, because in America, we are all about consolidation and commodification. So now we have President's Day. You know, we forgot poor Mr. Lincoln had a specific day and connected to the Emancipation Proclamation. The second was February 1st, as we know, is the day closest to historians establishing the birth of Frederick Douglass in February 14th of 1818. And then the third day was the congregation of Lincoln's first speech on his way to his first inauguration. And he was here in Pennsylvania, and specifically in Harrisburg, on February 22nd of 1861, on his way to Washington, D.C. for his first inauguration. I want to get to a point about an assassination attempt on Mr. Lincoln in 1861. But Carter looked at those 3 dates, February 12th, February 14th, and February 22nd, and he set his Black History Week in the middle of February between those dates, and it is extended to February. So the first myth is that it wasn't because somebody decided it was the shortest month of the year. But with Martin Luther King's Day in January 19th, and with the number of dates in March, Women's Month, to celebrate women, we have the capacity to make Black History Month really from January 15th to March 15th, looking at from the discussion of the Emancipation Proclamation here in Harrisburg in January 15th of 1863 to that date in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Vote. Vote, vote, vote. If we had blackout right now, I'd be shouting. So the message of the evening is the struggle for the vote. So here's the second did you know? Did you know that Black people in Pennsylvania voted until 1838? Yes, Black people in Pennsylvania, men and women who owned property, didn't rent, owned property and paid taxes, voted in the state of Pennsylvania until 1838. In 1838, there was a violent reaction by a conservative right about white supremacy and the empowerment of African Americans growing and taking political positions, and against the advice of people across the state like Robert Purvis, who was the president of the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. The Constitution of Pennsylvania was changed in 1838, and Black men and women lost the right to vote here. So 1870s 15th Amendment and 1870s 15th Amendment and 1920s 19th Amendment are not the first time we voted. It was reparation. It was the repair of our vote. But it also showed us how really fragile the vote is, Richard. And I sat up this morning as I was preparing for tonight. I'm preparing to talk about losing the vote in 1838, while on the news is a discussion about a voting act It's still being fought in 2023. Think about this, Richard. It's an act. After all this time, we still do not have a right. We have an act. And acts expire like the freshness on your milk, like the meat in your refrigerator, like the pills in your closet. Acts expire, rights do not. And so we are still struggling for the right to have a franchise, a citizenship, a seat on a jury, a position on a council, and we have only been given at best tentative permission to reside in the United States. We are still fighting for a Civil Rights Act, a Voting Rights Act, and a Public Education Act. And so the struggle is not for the lazy, So that's I want to say that the myth is that our vote is comfortable and confident. It must be fought for. It must be protected with vigilance and with courage every day.
I think that's very important, and I've been trying to tell the audience that, but when we have to stay on top of it. I mean, we know that voter ID, what is that about? We know that they want people to bring in certain documents before they vote. So there's been a process, as you said, to make it harder. This is supposed to be America. This is supposed to be easy. Now all of a sudden they start to make it much more difficult, not just in Pennsylvania, but all over. And we got to step up to the plate and make sure that we know what goes on in those hollow halls, what they call democracy, whether it's in Washington or whether it's in your state capital. Because what happens is too often, and I say it all the time we figured it all out, the horse is already out the barn and it's gone and it's too late.
And this is a perpetual attack. It's like a pendulum. America is built with 1 foot on the Declaration of Independence and 1 foot on the Constitution of the United States. Now, the Declaration of Independence is like a manifesto. It's like a wish list. It's like what we aspire to be. It's like a mission statement or a vision statement. But the Constitution is a contract. The Constitution is about who is in and who is out. And the contract started on the premise of compromise. The contract started with what is called the 3/5 Act. The Congress of the Constitutional Congress could not bring the North and the South together at the building of America because of the issue of slavery,
Correct.
of enslavement. And so a deal was made, and it was a deal, and nothing else but a backroom deal. A deal was that we would sign this Constitution if those who own enslaved people were given 3/5 of a vote for every Black person that they owned. 3/5 of a vote in what is called an act of patriarchy, that I will protect you. Now think about this, Richard. So you're telling me that I'm not really a human being. You're telling me that I'm cattle. You're telling me that I'm like your sofa, that I am property, and I should be listed in your taxes as property and should not be given any rights. You don't give your chickens, and you don't give your sofa, and you don't give your wagon the opportunity to talk back. So why should I give this enslaved person? But I also need to control the Congress of the United States. And to do that, I need votes. So I'm going to turn the coin over and I'm going to say, but this person is not really not a whole person. They're 3/5 of a person. And so for every 3/5 of a person or every 5 people, I get a couple extra votes when I go into the voting booth. That changes the voice of what I vote for. And that is why out of the first 20 presidents of the United States, 15 of them were slaveholders. And that is why in several elections, it has gotten down to the electoral college. And that is still the argument. Are we full citizens, or are we parts of the product, parts of the commodity, and parts of the patriarchy to be taken care of? The deal was made, and then they made a new deal in Pennsylvania to try to get around this notion, and it was called the Gradual Abolition Act. And the Gradual Abolition Act, which was passed in 1787, said, okay, I'll make a deal. From today on, anybody who is an enslaved person, I'm trying not to use the noun slave, because slave is a noun, enslaved is a verb. You know, we're not called slaves. we were enslaved. The act was set upon us. So if you all could help me by not calling yourself a slave, then you will not spiritually think of yourself as a bonded person for life. You will think of a condition that has been laid upon you. We also don't call ourselves fugitives, because we're freedom seekers. You know, we're not running away from something, we're running towards something. We're running towards freedom. So those listening to me can help me with that. But they got around this thing. They said, okay, Pennsylvania's gonna be free, but not right away. We're gonna wait. Anybody who's born after this day, July 1st of 1787, will be freed on their 27th birthday. On their 27th birthday. Provided that their master has no debts or entitlements against their estate. Now, the lifespan of an African American woman was 31. The lifespan of an African American man at that time was 18. So not a lot of people were living to their 27th birthday if they work hard. But think of this: if you had a brother that was born the day before July 1, he was still a slave. He was still enslaved. It was the new child that was born. So your mother and father could still be enslaved in Pennsylvania. You were on your way, you know, sometime around 1816, which happens to also be the year that Wesley AME Zion Church was first formed in Harrisburg, in a log cabin, by the way. Around about 1816, we begin to see people who are freed through manumission, through the legal. But we also had this law, Richard, that said that Pennsylvania was a free soil state. We passed that in 1803. So that meant that, I'm sorry, this is important that I get the year right. 1799, we passed that. And that said that anybody who made it to Pennsylvania and stayed here 6 months and 1 day was free. This started an Underground Railroad movement to the Mason-Dixon line. And Gettysburg was 9 miles from the Mason-Dixon line. Chambersburg was 18 miles from the Mason-Dixon line. Harrisburg was the first big city across the Mason-Dixon line. And so if you could make it to Philadelphia, to Pittsburgh, to Harrisburg, to York, to Lancaster, and you could stay here for 6 months and 1 day, and the bounty hunters were on your butt, they were looking for you, then you were freed. This is why George Washington, Richard, wrote a manual to people. Now, Philadelphia was the capital then, saying, do not bring your enslaved people to Pennsylvania longer than 6 months and 1 day. George Washington had a whole plan for rotating his enslaved people out, for taking them across the border to Maryland. The moment you were gone, the clock was set back. So enslavement in the North was a rocky road thing. Everybody likes to tell the story about John Harris and how Hercules, his enslaved person, freed him from being burned by the Indians after going across to the West Bank and getting a tribe of friendly Indians to come in and save his master. Nobody gives Hercules credit for knowing who the friendly Indians and who the ones that were going to burn you were. But John Harris supposedly freed Hercules by manumission, and we like to tell that story in Harrisburg. That how good our forgive me, folks, for saying it this way, but how good our white folks were. But consider this: did you know that while John Harris freed Hercules, he did not free Hercules' wife? He did not free Hercules' children enslaved. He, in fact, gave those children to his son and his grandson, John Harris Jr. and Richard Harris. And by 1840, those children were being sold into Maryland so that their time wouldn't run out on the gradual abolition. So freedom, we like to talk about the South. We'd like to talk about enslavement in the South, but it is time for us to talk about slavery in the North and the shift of enslavement to indentured servitude and tenant farming and the demise of our neighborhoods, Richard. Every time a Black community would grow up, it would be taken by eminent domain and the community would be scattered.
I think that's, let me ask you this question here, because I can hear somebody say, okay, that was a long time ago. Why do we need to know all about that?
Well, you need to know all about that because you need to know all about eminent domain. You need to know that no matter how much wealth you develop, how much enterprise you develop, that unless you protect the laws and the regulations, the licenses and the councils, your community can be taken up, like Judytown, which was the name of the Black neighborhood at 3rd and Mulberry Street. Now, this church, Wesley AME Church, was founded in a log cabin at 3rd and Mulberry Street at Judytown. Judytown's neighborhood grew up and was prosperous, and they took it by eminent domain to build the Pennsylvania Railroad. And they moved the Black community to the old 8th Ward. Well, we know that the old 8th Ward was taken up through eminent domain and moved out. They moved to what was called Verbecktown, which is Verbeck near the Broad Street Market. Did you know that that was a Black neighborhood, friends? Did you know that Verbeck bought 80 houses from old 8th Ward, took them apart, reconstructed them on lots, and sold them to Black families? They moved them again to what was called Forest Ridge, and they moved them again. Every 20 years, as the African American community grew up in Harrisburg, some act by legislation, and that can happen. It's happening right now. It's called gentrification.
Well, people, right, but people don't understand that not only just Harrisburg, but we can talk about Pittsburgh, we can talk about Philly, we can talk about any city.
You can talk about Cincinnati.
We
can talk about Wilmington.
They're all the same. It's really funny sometimes because people don't put it in perspective.
And it's the same thing, Richard, that is happening now with our redlining and our gerrymandering of our districts to affect the outcome. So history is a map. History is a blueprint. History is a thumbprint. History is not a sepia tone, dusty, old, smoky thing that we're given that we can. It is a building plan for how to participate in citizenship, and it is embedded in it the struggle also. How did people much stronger than me deal with this. In 1980 and 1960 and 1930 and 1910 and 1890, Plessy versus Ferguson and Dred Scott, and all those things that we were taught in isolation all fit into the crazy quilt tapestry of our attempt to be full citizens and not just sojourners here.
And I think that's important, and you know, because a lot of people don't know about the Dred Scott. People don't know about Percy. They don't know about those things because nobody talked about them and nobody told them. I think part of that responsibility is for us to tell our own story.
Right.
And that's why people don't understand certain things. That's why I get upset when I hear someone say, you got to understand baseball. We think about Jackie Robinson. Great. But just think about all those people that were far better than Jackie Robinson, but before Jackie Robinson never got an opportunity to play baseball.
And that's not to diminish Jackie Robinson.
No.
But you know, I mean, I mentioned earlier, for example, there's a gentleman, his name is Jacob Compton. I love to tell Jacob Compton's story.
Sure.
Jacob Compton was an African American from Maryland. His father was an enslaved person. His mother was free through manumission, and she came into Pennsylvania and had her child, so that her child was born free and he was a freeman. Now, his father was sold deeper into the South when she came here, you know, and he never saw his father again. He excelled as an equestrian, as a horseman, and he was given the job of the carriage driver and the horseman for Simon Cameron, who was Abraham Lincoln's first Secretary of War. So when Abraham Lincoln came here in 1861 on his way to his first inauguration, he was speaking at the Capitol. He was staying at the Jones Hotel, which is down there on the corner of 2nd and Mulberry Street. And Pinkerton guards, Pinkerton safety, came up and said, you know what? They're trying to kill you here, brother. You need to get out of Dodge. You need to get out right now. He said, no, I've got 1,000 people standing in the street waiting for me. And they said, unless you leave tonight, we cannot guarantee your safety. How am I going to get out of town? Everybody knows I'm here. Everybody knows somebody's looking for me. They called Jacob Compton, who had been a conductor on the Underground Railroad. He knew secret routes out of Harrisburg to Middletown, and he conducted Abraham Lincoln to safety into a single car in which Lincoln was able to escape to Hanover and to Baltimore and on to his destiny. Jacob Compton, what if Jacob Compton didn't come to work that day? What if Lincoln hadn't lived? What if Lincoln lived? You know, how did Lincoln feel about enslavement? What was his, you know, well, we've been sold a bunch of Lincoln myths. I mean, Lincoln said himself, if I could save the Union without freeing one person, I would do it. And if I could save the Union by freeing everyone, I would. So you and I grew up with the myth that Lincoln freed the slaves. No, the war freed the enslaved people, the military might, the legal action. Lincoln was trying to make a deal. Lincoln freed the enslaved people in Washington, D.C. in 1862 before the Emancipation Proclamation. Let me say that again for all of you who are from Washington. The first people to be freed through executive order in the United States were the enslaved people in Washington, D.C. in September of 1862, freed through executive order by Abraham Lincoln. What did he do? He paid, Richard. He paid those holders of enslaved people. We argue about reparation. Lincoln reparated. He paid so many people, Richard, that his treasury came and said, you can never do that again.
That is correct. But people don't know that. People do not know that the slave holders got paid. I do know that. Got paid to let them go.
The slaveholders in Delaware had made a deal with Lincoln that they were going to be the next or the first actually state. Delaware never freed their enslaved people to the end of the Civil War, but his treasury said, we don't have enough money. There were 5 million enslaved people. The average price of a male was $300. The average price of a female who could bear child was $1,000 because the children of an enslaved woman were slaves. So women and procreation was a part of the making of that market. This requires me to pause just a minute. Forgive me, you all, if this is too many dates, but everybody was trying to do the right thing. You know, there was an act of humanity in Black and white communities and against enslavement. And so the movement, which was international, achieved the end of the Atlantic slave trade in 1808, Richard. But it backfired because what they did is they passed the Perpetual Slave Act, which meant if you were born of a mother who was a slave, you are a slave for the rest of your life. Forgive me for using slave instead of enslaved. So in 1808, what did it do? It made America a breeding farm, and it made the price of women greater than the price of men. And women having babies, who's your baby's daddy is because everybody was supposed to have babies. It was like chicken farming, or you know, the procreation became the commoditization, where America now was a baby factory for the Caribbean ring, and for countries like Canada, although they free their enslaved people. So this making humans into a commodity comes up through legal acts. And you have to keep your eye on those legal acts, which is why we keep talking about voting. The legal act in 1792 was that slavery was abolished in the first Gradual Abolition Act, except, Richard, except if you were arrested or imprisoned for a crime or offense which you could not bail yourself out for. Then you could be enslaved.
Which
you could
we
be put
know-
into prison.
Which we know now that we have prisons, and we know what they are.
They're plantations.
They're plantations in 2023, whether you want to admit it or not.
And that's 1792. Since 1792, we have been arresting Black people and putting them into prison. Vagrancy laws, you don't have an apartment, you don't have a house. So what do? I take this Black community through eminent domain. The people rent, they don't own, so I turn them out into the street. Now they don't have a legal address. I can arrest them. I can put them in jail to do their time. And this begins a systemic and endemic system of road gangs, factory workers,
Sure.
field workers.
So what do you, so I mean, you've given a lot of dates. So what would you say to my audience? Because we're in the next 10, 15 minutes, because we're rolling here.
So
today.
let me tie a bow on that before
Tie
I
a bow.
go. So, folks, 1792 to 2023, we have had a Jim Crow de facto segregation law that said that if you are imprisoned, your labor belongs to the state. And if you don't vote for prison regulation for uh, we've had this problem in Pennsylvania, particularly about faith and religion and the role that religion plays, and whether we should be penitent or reformative. And we go back and forth between should we punish people, or should we reform them? So now we've got a situation where in good times we think about reforming. There are 200 young men went through a barbershop course in prison, in the California prison system, who were let out. This is a case that Pennsylvania needs to look at. But were taught barbering and cosmetology to have a skill when they came out of prison. But because they were felons, they could not get a license to practice. You know, they could not vote. They could not get a license to practice. They could not serve on juries. So we perpetuate. Do you know that we have 44% adult illiteracy in the United States, in working class people with 2 or 3 jobs that cannot read a bus schedule, cannot fill out a check, So when you brought up the issue about literacy and education, that has been our call from the time we rose up out of plantation life. We've started our own church schools, our own community schools, So when I say vote, I'm not talking about the presidential vote. I'm not even talking about the biannual Senate and Congress vote. I'm talking about for your dog catcher, for your school board, for your magistrate, because those are the people who affect your life. That's on the ground is where you need to be in politics today. That is why the Black Lives Matter movement was so powerful. But what was said to me is this, and I'm so sorry to be giving you so many statistics, but did you know that millions of kids graduate in America every year at age 18 that are eligible to vote? And the average time they vote for the first time is at age 25 to 30. Now, we could change all those bright young spirits that were in the streets for Black Lives Matter who were calling out for change. They have the power. You have the power. It is called your vote. You have that power. And if we could actualize, activate, instigate 18 to 25-year-old people of color to get involved on their block, in their district, that's a powerful. I'm not talking about. I'm 75 years old. I'll be 76 this year. I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about you all out there who have closed it off because you think it's about something that ain't about you. And what it is about is, will you ever be a full citizen? Will you ever be a right instead of an act? I mean, acts expire, and if we carry this through the 21st century, it would be a sad occasion. I mean, this is where we came in the movie, Richard. It's civil rights, voting for our civil rights, and so the fact that we are still talking about civil rights means that, just like you said, we're waiting for somebody to save us when we have this power to convene and this power to agitate and call our vote. You got to educate yourself to do that. You got to know stuff. You cannot buy into the myth. I mean, and I know we're running out of time, but myth number 1, Rosa Parks. That sister was not an old housekeeper. She wasn't even an old woman. That sister was not a tired lady who just decided she had had enough and sat down. This was a strategic campaign by the Southern Christian Leadership Union to test the validity of public transportation by using Rosa Parks. The first person that tested it was a young lady by the name of Claudine, but she was 16 and jet black, and she was the mother of an illegal child.
Right.
And they didn't believe that they had a good case with her. So they chose Rosa Parks because you had to question, because of her light skin, whether she was black. You had to ask her, like Plessy. They had to ask Plessy, was he black? Because they chose him because of his light skin to push and test the law. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks were 22 and 23-year-old workers in the Civil Rights Act. When Rosa sat down, she was still considered by all is a young woman in the movement. But this was a planned strategy, and we have to stop thinking that any progress we have made has been incidental. There has been Black organizations through the Color Convention since 1810. We have had national congresses of colored leadership. We have had NAACPs and all those kind of social reform organizations. Our Masons and our Elks have been strategic leaders in the Underground Railroad movement, in the Jim Crow movement, in the 20th century movements, and now into the 21st century movements. So, no, we didn't win anything by accident. We won it by strategic thinking, by continuous organization, by vigilance, by hard work, and it's coming down hard on us. Just watch the news tonight. Every story I've told you in history is a frontline story on your news tonight about where we fit in. And so, is it a mistake or an accident that DeSantos, on the first day of Black History Month, can announce that AP Black History is not being taught in our universities anymore? Is it an accident on the first day of Black History Month that Toni Morrison's books are being taken off the shelf? Did we really think, Richard, that we were going to see book burning again in our time? That we were going to see ourselves removed from history like William Howard Day, a minister of this church, was? Like David Stevens, a Black man who was the first or the second Grand Marshal of the Masons in the historic Old 8th Ward, which is somewhere under the annex of the Capitol now, was the old Wesley AME Church's footprint. So we have to look not at what is there, but what is not there, what has been systemically removed from our intelligence. There is a full frontal attack on our intelligence. And if we let it happen, someone will be sitting in some form of a studio 20 years from now, repeating these dates again.
I think that it's important what you said, but do you agree we have to start doing our own homework and research?
I totally agree. With all due respect, African Americans, we take our kids to kindergarten and we pick them up in 12th grade. We drive them to college and we go to graduation. You have to be an active part of your child's education. You cannot expect any American school system where school teachers are going to be trained to carry guns into their classrooms, where they have to know how to give people who are on fentanyl, the roles that are placed on school teachers now can't possibly mean that they can do a full job on the teaching of culturally specific education. And so that has to be in the home. That has to be in the church. That has to be in the community.
Thank you. I want to thank you. I mean, time went so fast here this evening, but is to get you to think. What's the name of this program? Did you know? You didn't know, but you should know. And things that you don't know, you need to learn for yourself. You need to do your own research, your own history. But we keep waiting on the easy way for someone to tell us, opposed to us knowing it for ourselves.
I'd like to ask your audience to do one favor for me, and then I'm gone.
Go ahead.
Okay? I want you all to go home to whatever you call home, and I want you to go under your bed or up in your closet or into that old trunk, and I want you to get out all those old documents that your mama and your grandmama and your great-grandmama told you were important enough to keep, but you didn't know why, and lay them out. They are a puzzle. They are an anagram of your journey to freedom, and organize them, put them on the wall, start teaching your children who your ancestors were. The census said my grandfather was a coal truck driver in Pittsburgh. He's listed in the census as hauling coal, but he was the grand marshal of the Elks. He was the grand master of his lodge. He was the deacon of his church. You know, he was not. Hauling coal is what he did to buy milk for his children. Raising consciousness is what he did for his community. So you are somebody. Find out who you are first.
And I think that's very important, and that's why a lot of young people act the way they act, because
don't know who they are.
They don't know who they are. So he gave you an assignment. I hope tonight has been informational. But the most important thing, if you get nothing else from this program tonight, is do your own research.
Right.
Do your own homework. But
Find out who you are.
Who you are, because we all are somebody.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll be seeing you in a couple weeks. Thank you for another
Thank
Did
you for
Know?
joining the Richard. Thank you for joining the Richard Utley Show on The Voice 17104. We will be here on The Voice 17104 every first and third Tuesday from 6:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. Once again, thanks for viewing. Remember to visit us on Facebook at Richard Utley